Hi, everybody. Today's April 27th, 2023, and I'm honored to have one of my favorite authors. I've owned his book for some time, Daniel J. Flynn, the author of The War on Football. This is a book from 10 years ago, but perhaps you can get us up to date. Tell us a little bit about your theory in the book and about yourself.
Hey, it's great to be here. Yeah, I wrote the book because I initially wrote an article because there was a lot of chatter in the press from LZ Granderson, from George Will, and from a number of other people that football shortens lives. That people in the NFL, there was a lawsuit, or not a lawsuit, the NFL Players Association, the union, they had petitioned NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety, or Safety and Health, to do a study, a mortality study on whether football players die young. And there was a lot of chatter in the press, like I said, from George Will, from LZ Granderson, from Malcolm Gladwell, from all sorts of people, advancing this idea that players in the NFL die at an earlier age. And I think the reasoning for this was basically that they would see obituaries of NFL players that would die in their 50s, and they would say, well, this must mean they die young, and not really looking at guys that lived to an advanced age, like Art Donovan or Frank Gifford or someone like that. So the federal government looked at about 3,500 NFL players who played from 1959 up until I think the early 1990s. And they found not only did NFL players not die young, but they were outliving the general population. They're expecting to find, I think, based on that number of players and the age and the averages and all that, they were expecting to find 625 deaths. And what they did find was 334 deaths. And so it was drastically reduced. They were expecting to find an 18% death rate. It was a 10% death rate. And so when I wrote an article in the American Spectator basically saying, hey, this isn't true. Here is the data. There's a lot of people saying that NFL players die young, but they actually looked at every single NFL player who played, I think it was 5 or more seasons or 4 or more seasons. And it showed that if you play football for a long time, you tend to live for a long time. And they looked at 17 different disease rates or mortality rates in different diseases. And in things like respiratory illness, they had a 20% death rate of what the population was. So it was 5 times greater in the general population. And so things like heart disease, and what was, I think, most shocking was even suicide, because we've heard a lot of that, right? Anytime for a good period of time, anytime that you heard, say like a Junior Seau or any big time NFL player who committed suicide, they thought, well, these guys were getting CTE, and that means they must kill themselves at accelerated rates. The societal rate of suicide was 2.5 times the rate of the NFL suicide rate. And I actually, just for my own benefit, I went and did sort of like an informal study of Major League Baseball players. They actually died of suicide at a higher rate than NFL players. So a lot of what we had heard in the press was false. It was just based on mythology. And what I did is I wrote this article in the American Spectator. People saw, I just thought it was I read a couple articles a week there, and someone saw it and said, hey, why don't you write a book? And I thought, well, why doesn't Deion Sanders write the book? Why doesn't Jerry Jones write the book? Why do I have to write the book? I don't know that I'm the right guy to write this book. I played football in high school and I played Pop Warner, but I'm not, not a great football player or anything like that. I just sort of an average American kid that played sports. I don't think I'm the right guy for this book, but the reality was that no one else was writing this book. And if no one else is doing it, someone's got to step up. And that's why I ultimately decided to write it.
Well, thank you so much for writing it. It was, I can't literally say eye-opening because my eyes were open while I was reading it to begin with, and they stayed open for the duration of. They probably blinked here and there, but I found it captivating. You brought up kind of an interesting aspect, which is the way narratives are formed, and your book. Again, I really commend and recommend people read it. It's a great read. You've got some interesting chapters, but it's not necessarily a shock that people in football live longer. First of all, they've made some coin, and they have a nest egg from which to preserve. But there's also versus. I mean, it's probably they live longer than the general population, but probably they live longer than their cohort from the same neighborhood and same demographics. there's something like lift all boats or whatever. Not every boat gets lifted in some of the say, well, inner city black neighborhoods and so forth, from which a fair number of the NFL players come. I'm not. I'm pretty sure NFL is a majority black participant sport in the professional level, and that cohort doesn't live as long as the average in the U.S. And so, what is it? What's magical about football? Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything per se, except that people have rigor. They have the kind of the ethos of working out, of maintaining weight, of at least probably not smoking, and a bunch of things that keep their athletic career longer. So they having longevity in your career when you're making the most you'll ever make in your entire life, unless you're kind of the Michael Jordan, Tom Brady category, where you can probably make money forever. But a lot of players, that is their moment in the sun, and in order to maximize that, they have to learn some healthy habits. They have to learn eating right and all that kind of stuff, and some of that must stick. Anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts
Well,
about that, and
well,
about some of the kind of counter aspects of what life is like without football. Let's imagine Joe and Jim, growing up, and one has organized sports and the other does not. I mean, what happens to boys after? Let's say we disappeared football completely because it's dangerous. What would happen to city youth, say?
Well, I think 2 points. On your earlier point with regard to what this cohort is doing, I actually interviewed a couple of the scientists at NIOSH. I think there were 5 or 6 of them that did the study. And I interviewed the lead scientist on that study. And I interviewed another one of his peers that wrote that study. And I said, "Were you surprised?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why?" He said, "This is a Superman cohort." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well, these guys are, every fall they're going out, they're running, jumping, pushing, pulling, they're exercising in the off season, they're weight training, they're running. Um, they're probably eating better than the average person to maintain that physique. They have access to the best medical care, at least if they get to the NFL. They are people that have access to money, obviously." So there's a lot of things that go into that really make it a kind of a duh. Like the best science is sort of like a duh science. Like, of course, why are we even questioning this? And yet you had people for years, really. I mean, at the time, George Will, guy I really admire, and I've talked to him. Malcolm Gladwell, a guy that used to work for the American Spectator. These are high level people repeating just lies, just repeating something that was pushed out as propaganda. I think initially because the union wanted some kind of a settlement, or they wanted more of a share from the NFL. And what it turned out is that this NIOSH study found the exact opposite of what the union thought. They thought they were going to, like a lot of times, coal workers or,
Hmm.
fishermen or some kind of dangerous profession. They'll do the government will do a study and find out, geez, these guys die at a way higher rate than the average population. It wasn't that way with football. It was the opposite. And I think the fact that what this guy said to me, "Hey, this is a Superman cohort." Of course, it wasn't. They were going to live longer. I thought, yeah. And to your other point, what are these guys? What would these guys be doing if not for football? I think if football didn't exist, someone would invent it, because there's a lot of boys out there. I don't know if you know any 11-year-old boys, but some of them got a lot of energy and they like to run around and they're hyper and they like to, get physical on the playground. And I think particularly with boys that are a little bigger, there's a big obesity problem in this country. I really think the problem is not young people's brains getting battered around. It's their bellies. It's the fact that they're big. Now, if you're a big kid, you probably have disadvantages in a lot of sports. You certainly have disadvantage in
Hmm.
soccer if you got a lot of fat hanging around. But if you're a bigger kid, the one sport where you have a big advantage is football. And I think football is an excellent way to get some of these bigger kids off the couch and into some cleats. And in that sense, it's a very healthy thing, because obviously we do have an obesity epidemic in this country. I don't know when you were born, but in 1970, I think it was something like 5% of kids were obese, and I don't know. And now it's above a quarter, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a rather dramatic increase in obesity in this country, and I think sports football in particular, but there's other sports that probably do a better job of it. Sports are a good way to get those kids into some activities. And this is obviously ignoring your major point, which is a lot of these guys come from the inner city. They come from bad places. And as a result of that, they find themselves in more dangerous situations. Football usually takes them out of that.
I agree. And one example comes to mind. I think single parenthood is a far more dangerous prescription in a sense for boys than for girls in a given household, because almost always that single parent is a mother, except for my three sons or something like that. But it's almost always a mom at home. So a young daughter has a role model of a mom, a woman, and she might be working, she might be doing this and that, but that's a woman, and a woman, the girl is going to be able to see that and relate to it. The boy doesn't have that. The boy has no role model in the house ostensibly, and I think the attraction of gangs might be compulsive in a sense, that they want you. It may not be so much you want the gang, but it might be kind of mutual in some aspects, because the gang does provide an order. And boys like that. They at a certain point when they kind of get bigger than their mom. I remember, doing that. My mom was 5'2", so it kind of happened relatively early for me. I didn't really kind of I didn't care so much about her authority as I got bigger. I got strong and so forth. But my dad was there. He was bigger than he may rest in peace. He was a tall man, and there's kind of that yin and yang, almost literally, of what goes on in a household. And if you're absent that, there's a lot of kind of moral hazard out there. There's a lot of attractive nuisances and so forth. And the example that comes to mind for me is one. I don't know if you heard of this guy. They call him the King James or something like that. LeBron James. He plays basketball. He could easily play football, mind you.
I think I've heard of him.
He'd be an awesome tight end, and probably linebacker, and probably both. Anyway, I think he'd be a fabulous football player had he chosen it. But he was born into a household where he literally does not, I think to this day, does not know his dad, which is kind of an amazing thing, because you figure some guy out there would want to be attached, at least, maybe get,
I don't think Mike Tyson knew his dad.
I understand, but these are guys who have made probably $1 billion over their lifetimes.
Yeah.
And nobody out there wants to get some of the fame, notoriety, and maybe coin money as well of making that. So this is a total absence of knowing who the dad is. So he's completely absent. And his mom, we'll say she probably had an illicit, a couple different illicit activities simultaneously running in her life. From my understanding, is put him up for either foster care or adoption, and he was brought up by a football coach, a youth football coach. I think maybe I think it might have been a high school coach or something like that. And Mr. James, I think, talks about this at certain moments, about how he was told there are rules. This is how things are run here. And I'm maybe he played on the football team or not, I don't know, but his life is exemplary. I don't love every word that comes out of his mouth, but I certainly admire the work ethic. I mean, to be running with the young guys, the 22-year-olds at 38 or whatever he is right now, and in the flow of it is incredible. And that comes from discipline. It comes from not doing other things too. And
you don't hear of LeBron James off the court getting in any sort of scrapes with the law or any kind of issues with women or stuff. You just don't hear that. And so, like you said, there's all sorts of issues that he's outspoken on that I may agree with him or I may disagree with him. But I think you have to look at the guy's character, and obviously he's not getting into any sort of mischief whatsoever. I think about, there's a lot of athletes that fit that description. Muhammad Ali famously got in touch with this policeman in Louisville who brought, sort of took him under his wing and introduced him to boxing. I don't really know a whole lot about Muhammad Ali's home situation, but I do know that policeman had a great effect on his life. Profound effect, obviously. Customato with Mike Tyson would be another example of that, although I think Customato sort of gave him a long leash, and that had some repercussions later on the line. But that's a story that is not all that unfamiliar, obviously. And so, they made a movie about that guy, The Blind Side. So there's a lot of guys that have some troubled aspects to them. and sports will, offer a correction of that. And I think the reason for football, I mean, it's so obvious. On every day on a football field, someone gets knocked into the dirt and they have a choice. Are you going to stay down in the dirt or are you going to get up? To me, that's a metaphor for life. Football is a metaphor for life, that on every play, someone is getting knocked into the ground, into the mud, and they have a decision to make. Are they going to get up and fight, or are they going to stay down in the mud? And a lot of people in life, you probably noticed people you grew up with, some people stay down in the mud. They don't get
Absolutely.
up. And
Absolutely.
in football, it at least teaches you get up and fight. And, not everyone who played football is going to get up and fight in life. But I think that metaphor in sports, and I mean, you find metaphors in long distance running. I mean, there's all sorts of life lessons in all sorts of sports. Football is not the only one. But I do think that one lesson from football is an important one. And I think it helps people who do play.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that I was a runner at certain points. I played some sports, soccer and wrestling and a little bit of track and whatnot. But in football, my older son was kind of in that category you mentioned above. Overweight, a lot of games. He was a super gamer, and he's done well in life. He's got a good economic sense. I think some of that was developed from kind of the economies within games. You have to be considering multiple different factors and so forth. And he's yeah, and just as a plug, he's got two podcasts. One is called the Pravdcast, Pravd, like Pravda cast on Ukraine, the Russo-Ukrainian war. And he's got another one called Synopsis, like China, Sino. And they're both excellent podcasts with his friend Michael Williamson. Anyway, that's a plug. There are excellent things, but that's his mental side. But the physical side, he was big. He was he had extra insulation, and so he played football. He did wrestling and he did lacrosse. And football, I don't think he ever started, but he played on the line. But wrestling had a similar aspect because I think he started as a heavyweight, and then moved down as he got leaner. But that was another sport in which there was a lot of discipline and there was a lot of rules, and you had to get your body in shape. And there was it's a competition, that you have to make things work. Football was, I think, less enjoyable for him. I don't think he had the talent, whatever. But there's different kind of personality aspects that fit in with football, that maybe is a little bit different from other sports. I think you see it a little bit in baseball, probably in every sport, but in football there are positional differences. So you don't necessarily have to be a huge intellect to kind of grasp the thing. It gets a lot of our feral, kind of human, kind of say, more ancient aggressions and need to hunt and all that kind of stuff. It puts that out on the field. So you have, he played offensive line, and the characteristics of offensive linemen and defensive linemen are very different in a sense. People on defense are much more reactive, and the offense have to be much more kind of studious. And you have to know the plays in advance.
Some of the
And
smartest players are usually offensive linemen.
We've made this problem of ADHD or ADD, and I have a separate talk with Yaakov Ophir from Israel, talking about maybe the overdiagnosis of ADHD and how it's very much boy-centric, male-centric, and a lot of it is capturing and identifying problems that boys have, or not necessarily problems. I think they're actually attributes. If you imagine us in the forest or the jungle, and we have to go hunting, it's very good to not necessarily focus on one thing. You don't want to be focusing, oh my God, this is a fern. Look at all the leaves. How many leaves are there? And you have attention surplus, and somebody, jumps on your back and eats you. It's like, that's not helpful. There is an aspect that I think an AD, what gets called that kind of attention deficit is actually kind of a rapidity, kind of rapid eye kind of concern that really works out on defense. I think you can make an awesome safety, having ADHD. Because you're going to be like on the lookout, and so this is happening over there, but now there's something happening over there, and you attend to things in a faster manner, and somebody who's maybe more calculating, might do well, in a different position where the plays in advance. Anyway, so I think it kind of actually has kind of a bigger panorama, a spectrum of behavioral types that can fit into the sport, which isn't necessarily the same type of thing in something that's maybe more unifocused, like downhill skiing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that running around is a better drug than Ritalin to cure, what's called ADHD. If you activity, exercise, I think kids need a lot of that. And I think particularly if you have a lot of testosterone running in your body at a certain age and you just don't know how to handle that, sports are a good outlet for that, and football is an excellent outlet for it.
Right. So I want to segue a little bit into the kind of the history of adaptability and change in football. Um, I thought it was interesting in your book when you bring up Teddy Roosevelt and the helmet controversy back then. And I also want to talk about, maybe we'll get to this a little bit later about comparison of concussion rate in other sports, and whether helmets actually kind of decreased the rate of concussions in football.
Well, they used to play. There used to be a thing called a football player haircut. You've heard of a hockey player haircut, right? Which is like a mullet. There used to be what was called a football player haircut, which was almost a reverse mullet, where you'd have it a lot of thick hair here, so your hair would almost act like a helmet. And this was in the 1890s when very few people, if any, were wearing helmets. And very slowly you had these. The game adapted. I mean, when football started, it was essentially, they said, well, this kicking the ball in the goal, which is soccer, association football, soccer, wouldn't it be better to kick it above the goalpost instead of below it? And so there was these small alterations that happened from what was going on with the game over in Europe. And soccer kind of splits into rugby and soccer, and football obviously follows more of a rugby path. But they all kind of stem from the same game. And initially, even the name of the game is sort of anachronistic in the sense that, there's not a whole lot of foot involved in football anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so, back in the 1870s, 1880s, kicking the ball was how you would score points. I mean, if you scored a touchdown, you weren't going to get those points unless you kicked the ball over the upright afterwards. So very slowly, things started to change. Like you would get more, all of a sudden, I think in the 1890s or early 1900s, you had more points for, a touchdown than you did for a field goal. With that 1905 season, that was so deadly, where you had 26 guys die from various reasons. I mean, exhausted, getting football hits. You had all sorts of guys dying. And so they actually had a meeting at the White House. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was not a football player himself, but did go to the Harvard-Yale game when he was a student at Harvard. He went down to New Haven to watch. He was very much interested in the game. His son played on the freshman team at Harvard. And he famously said, sports are great if you make them a slave to you rather than you become a slave to sports. And I think that's a real great advice. Anyhow, that after that season, they banned a few things. One of the things they banned is offensive forward motion. So prior to that 1905 season, prior to the 1906 season, you could have an offensive player sort of running towards the line before the ball was hiked. They created something called the neutral zone after that season, where you had a little bit of space between the offense and defensive line where the ball was. And they allowed something for the first time, the forward pass. And so all of these things were thought to, maybe make the game a little bit safer. And, slowly you have other things being adopted, like, mandatory helmets and then mandatory face masks. And in the 1970s, you had, it's probably a bad idea to have the base of the goalpost on the field. Let's get that off the field to play.
Yeah, I actually remember that. I remember that on the field. And then they made that kind of curving arc one. I mean, they've done the same for basketball. Basketball hoops, the stanchion is I guess I don't have enough room to demonstrate, but I think everybody realizes the stanchion's far away, and they have the whole thing overhanging the same way the goalposts are now.
Yeah, and basketball is a funny sport too. Basketball developed in such a way that the guy who invented it basically disowned it, and he thought there should be a tip-off after every basket, and it's unfair to give it to the team who doesn't get the basket to get the ball. So all sports evolve.
He would hate the NFL draft itself, which is, in a sense, I mean, all these drafts are kind of a welfare
Yeah.
system in a sense. I mean, the Kansas City Royals in different sport, for years. I mean, they have a secondary market on failure. In baseball, they have the luxury tax. Where's the luxury tax goes? It goes to the teams that are bad. And for a long time, the Kansas City Royals model, I think for a couple decades, was to lose with a minimal roster, and they would just get the luxury tax money. So, and then they kind of built up the good players, like the Astros did the same thing. They get the top players in the draft over and over again, and they have very low budget, and then they wind up scoring. So the Astros have become really good, and the Royals won the World Series at a certain point. But not only through the luxury tax aspect, where if you fail you get paid for it, but year after year, if you're a bad team, you get the top draft picks. Anyway, sorry for that interjection.
Well, it's okay. So, and so in football, the changes came about much more dramatically because it's a violent sport. It's a revolutionary sport because it's a violent sport. And I think with baseball, the reason, there's been a big change this year with baseball with the pitch clock, obviously, and I think
Yep.
that was necessary. But the reality is, if you were to take a time machine and watch a baseball game from 100 years ago, it wouldn't be all that much different from a baseball game now. If you were to take a time machine and watch a football game from 100 years ago, or especially 120 years ago, you wouldn't know what you were watching. And so the game is dramatically changed. And so when there are people that get upset about some of the changes to make the game safer, I just point out the fact that the game had changed in much more dramatic ways in the past. And I think it's going to be okay. I mean, some of the changes, I agree, that probably went too far. I don't like the fact that they've taken the kickoff, essentially negated the kickoff in professional football. But, for the most part,
Well,
I don't
so
have.
I'm gonna devil's advocate on that one. I mean, I think if we're going to talk about concussions, the concussions are real. Um, I actually am happy that they are paying much more attention to not letting the wobbly guy, he doesn't
Sure.
know where he is, get back on the field. I like that concussion protocol. I don't think the CTE was as pervasive as they made it out to be. Speaking of $750 million settlements, we just had one with Fox and all that kind of stuff. Dominion. There was the previous $750 million settlement was on the NFL from the players group, and I'd like you to speak to that actual class of the class action suit, who they were, and how long they had spent in the NFL, whether they're representative of the NFL, and whether there was any kind of selection bias as far as that goes. But just to kind of stick with the kickoff concept for a second, when you're talking about concussions, it's actually not the linemen who get concussions in general. It's not the players who are. It's a velocity thing. There's I was a chemistry and physics major, and this is more physics, a little bit of medicine, but basically, boom, it's colliding. Ow, that hurt. It's colliding at speed. This doesn't hurt as much, and so you if you build up velocity and you're flying, so most concussion risk is between the cornerback and the wide receiver. Um, and you don't see as much. You can get it from other times. So for the hard hit to the ground, the quarterback can get it. Kind of the neck back, the flex, all that kind of stuff. But most of the time we see between cornerbacks themselves. Crossing routes, not seeing each other, and out in the wide gaps. In the kind of the Pop Warner middle school, high school level, the players don't actually achieve those kinds of speeds in general. And a lot of the youth football is a mush. There's a bunch of kids there, they're glomming together, and they don't have these 60-yard pass plays. Josh Allen was a child once, but even then he couldn't throw that distance, and you don't necessarily see the velocity. So I do, I think concussions are bad. I don't look forward to having any, and I'm not, I think they can be problematic, but I don't think they're to the extent that they were kind of made out in the class action suit. So I want to maybe if you could spend a minute talking about that class and also some of the metrics by which they used, and whether there was any kind of skin in the game, or a reverse, I suppose, reward system, spoil system from some of the people who came up with the methodologies.
Yeah. Just one point on the concussions in the NFL. I mean, if you look back, I mean, in 2010, they started sort of having a stat, how many concussions in a game and this kind of thing. In 2010, there were 270 concussions in the NFL. Last year, there was a 1-year spike. and I think there were 149 concussions last year. And so that was up from 126 the year before. So they've cut concussions down, depending upon what year you want to, parse the statistics, by almost, 50% some years from 2010. So it's a safer game. And I think some of the changes made it safer. And I'm not denying that negating the kickoff has made the game safer. I guess my point on that is that I just find it to be the most exciting play in all of sports when someone returns a kick, or maybe when they return an interception for a touchdown. And to take that out of the game, I don't particularly care for that. With regard to with the lawsuit, the NFL, I think what people didn't realize, and you referenced this a few minutes ago with them, settling with the players. This had to do with Riddell, the helmet manufacturer. Also there was a lawsuit with regard to the dangers of the game, and brain injuries and such. And about 10% of the guys suing the league had never played a down in an actual NFL football game. These are guys that were on what you'd call taxi squads. They were guys that played in the preseason that got cut. They carry like 90 guys in the preseason. They pare it down to 50 something. And so these are guys that had played, in many cases, they played in youth leagues like Pop Warner. They played in high school. They played in college. They may have played in other pro leagues. But
there was also the 87 strike year, wasn't there?
And the stipulation from these guys was that, well, it was just this brief cup of coffee that they had in the NFL that had caused whatever damage that they had. There were other guys that actually did play in games, but they were, what was derisively referred to as scab players, guys who played in those strike years, particularly 1987, where you had 3 games where players who, for the most part, were not in the league. There were some guys like, I think, Mark Gastineau and some others that stuck around and played. But for the most part, these were guys that were, kind of second-tier players that got their shot in the NFL. And a lot of these guys sued the league. With the Riddell lawsuit, what I found to be quite comical, you had Eric Dickerson suing in that Riddell lawsuit, and you see him on the cover of Sports Illustrated wearing a bike helmet. You had the late Kenny Stabler suing Riddell, and you see him on his football cards wearing a Wilson helmet. So there were all sorts of helmets that you could choose to wear in the NFL, and there were a lot of guys that chose not to wear the Riddell helmet, and yet they sued Riddell. And so I think for a lot of guys, this was a way to get one last paycheck out of the league. They see what guys are making now. They see that they clearly didn't make that money in the 80s or in the 70s, and so they joined this lawsuit. I am sure there were a lot of guys suing the league that took a lot of damage and probably had some complaints and said, well, gee, I can't, guy like Earl Campbell, his knees are all messed up and he can't really walk around that great. I'm sure guys like that took a lot of damage. So I don't want to say that football is a completely safe game and it's that you won't come out of it unscathed, because some guys do come out of it with some problems. But it just was funny that you had 10% of the guys suing the NFL that had never actually played in the NFL. And none of the national media outlets that were covering the story at the time, picked up on that. The last point I would make on the suit is that I don't know what the NFL is making a year at this point. I know that the Washington Redskins, the Washington Commanders, which isn't a very good team, but has a big
fan base. They sold for the most of any team.
$6 billion.
The other teams could have sold for even more. They just didn't happen to be for sale.
That's right. So they sold for $6 billion. And I think you mentioned that the settlement here was something short of $1 billion. And so I don't know that lawsuit settlement hurt the NFL so much as it did every other league that is not the NFL. Leagues that don't charge $60 for parking. Leagues that have to sell candy bars to pay for pads.
So you're talking about high school, college?
There was so much bad press with regard to football. There were actually people trying to act as though, putting your kid into football was tantamount to child abuse. And so a lot of the suburban leafy communities, the football teams shut down. When they would have to join with abutting communities just to field the team. When I went and looked at, I hung around with various football teams when I wrote this book. And one of the teams that I went to for like a week was a team that I had actually played for, a C team in Arlington, Massachusetts. And I had actually tried out for that team when I was 8 years old. But there were like 45 kids that tried out for it. And I was way too young. and not as good as the other kids. So I got cut when I was 8. I came back a few years later when I was the appropriate age, and I played for that team. But I got cut from that team because there weren't enough uniforms to go around. When I went and embedded with that team, 10 years, a little over 10 or 12 years ago, they couldn't field a scrub squad in their practice. They couldn't have a real, 11 on 11 because there weren't enough guys. I think there were 18 guys or something like that at practice. Now, you went from a situation in the 1980s where you had 45 guys going out for that team. And, 35 years later, 30 years later, you had 18 guys. So what happened there? And I think what happened was that there was this great push of publicity against football.
Yeah, it's taken all as dogma. I have a couple slides. I'm going to pop them in if you don't mind. I'll get to the one that's relevant, but first I'll just show this one. I think kind of funny. I mean, I'm not sure how much storage space costs for CBS Sports, but this one here, government study NFL's players living longer. That is, if you Google it, if you put it in CBS Sports now, fumble, which is kind of funny, they have a football analogy, but they moved that. I think it's still the New York Times, to their credit. This is 2012, but they still have this one up. NFL players live longer than other men, study says, but nobody hears about this. I'm going to leave it up for a second, but you can cut and paste this if you're listening, and you should repost this because it's a funny thing. I'm not saying if you start the NFL, you are going to live longer, because I know if I played, I would probably be demolished that day, especially at my age. Anyway, this is something I was in a hackathon in 2012 or 13, something like that, and we won. We had a device. Was not my idea, but I was part of the team, and it was a helmet device that was going to monitor the impact, so we could get better data for concussions. I'm sure they have something like this now. I'm sure there's sensors in the helmets that are doing this. But researching this, and we won our hackathon. We actually got rewarded by going to San Francisco. Nowadays, that is actually that's given to the losers to go to San Francisco. I'm just joking. No offense, San Francisco. I love the place. Anyway, there are a lot of other sports that this is non-fatal traumatic brain injuries related to sports and recreation activities. This is from your friendly CDC. And it's from persons aged less than 19 years old, from a 20-year, a 10-year, a decade of the noughts. And football is here. I have it in red. Bicycling. We don't really think, you don't hear much about bicycling. Well, you should stop bicycling, and you don't have your kids going to bicycle because it's going to give them a concussion. Golf. I'm not sure how many kids play golf, but here you have ice skating, horseback riding. There are things that sorry about that. There are things you can do that will get you hurt. It's called living. You can stop living, and we saw what that's like if you just lock yourself down for a couple of years and don't do anything. That is actually probably more disadvantageous to your health and longevity than these activities. So you pretty much have a choice between activities and no activities. And
can
your
point, I make a point on that? The bicycling.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, the war on football really is a cultural tick masquerading as a public health crusade. And the evidence for that, if you look at something like bicycling, which I love to bicycle, and I would recommend everyone bicycle, it's a great thing. But there's about 800 people in America that die every year from bicycling. The most recent season that we have statistics that there were 4 people that died of football hits. Now, in the history of the NFL, there's never been a player that died from a football hit. We almost had, we had a very
temporarily.
Well, yeah, we had a very scary situation this last season with Damar Hamlin. He got hit in the heart.
And you cannot mention that there might be any other type of medicinal underlay which might have brought about that particular unique circumstance that gave that temporary cardiac condition.
Well, I have no idea about anything like that with him.
I'm not saying there was, but you're just not allowed to mention any possible medical imposed mandate type of thing that would predispose somebody to a cardiac condition. Well, I'm just going to leave that out there.
I guess what I'm saying is that we used to, when people talked about the dangers of football, they didn't talk about players getting concussion. They talk about players getting killed. And in 1968, which is probably the most violent year in the Vietnam War, it was one of the most violent years in United States history, with bombings and assassinations and all sorts of crime exploding, riots. And it was also a violent year in football. And you had, I think, 36 guys die from football hits in 1968.
This is not the NFL. This is nationwide.
Everything. This is everything. So from football hits in that year, you had, the data is a little bit sketchy, but it's either 35 or 36 guys that had died at all levels of football. The most recent year, you have statistics, it was 4. And the year before that, it was 0. So there's been a huge shift where we don't talk about guys getting killed on the football field anymore, because that's a very rare thing that happens. 3 or 4 million guys playing football every year, people playing football. And you have it's like a 1 in a million thing where a guy will get killed doing that. And sort of, my point is that all activity carries risk, and football carries a certain amount of risk, but so does sitting on the couch. Exactly. And with regard, something like skateboarding, there's 25 kids a year that die from skateboarding because they're going down a hill or something, they hit a car or whatever they do. And the obstacles in skateboarding are a lot more unforgiving than even like Ray Lewis or Ray Nitschke or something like that. They're, cars and pavement.
Yep.
And so people don't want to talk about some of these other activities that kids engage in that are far more dangerous, like skiing or skateboarding or bicycling. I don't think anyone would say, let's ban these things. You'd be an idiot to say that. But I just think that people should recognize there's risk in all human activity. There's probably more risk in football than there is in baseball, but there's less risk in football than skateboarding and bicycling and skiing. And I don't think we should ban them. So when people say we should ban football, I don't think it's a data-driven thing. I think this is a lot of people that
it's emotional.
Don't like
these things are always, it's always stalking horse for something else, or Trojan horse or some other kind of horse. Or speaking of horses, horseback riding. This is
very dangerous.
Terrible segue. But Willie Sutton, the bank robber from the 30s, was asked why he robbed banks, and he said, "Well, that's where the money is." And so the reason you don't have a bunch of ex-horseback riders suing, I don't know, the horses or their trainers, or you don't have golfers suing, I don't know whom. You don't have ATV riders agglomerating to sue, the toboggans, sledding, moped, so forth. Is that there's no money there, and so you don't have the soccer is probably on a par. I mean, I coached youth soccer for a decade, and probably all year round. And I think we had the rare concussion, but they head the ball, and not every kid knows how to head the ball correctly, and so there's a lot of damage that goes on when they're misheading it. Plus, they go up to head as they get older. They can jump higher, and they have the velocity we're talking about, and they're heading against each other. And so boom, you can have these in-air head-to-head collisions, and a corner kick in professional soccer can yield that. Anyway, so what do we have now? We're kind of going around the we're at the I guess we're in the fourth quarter of our talk today, and I maybe leave it a little bit free form. I just did want to kind of go over this one slide, which mentioned some of the things you're talking about. This is the NFL suit over here in the I guess around the 2010 period, and participation in football has gone down. And then I guess this is really dense. My friend ChatGPT made that. Oops, I'm not showing the slides. I apologize. Let me just go back a little bit. So this is the slide showing the decrease in participation in football. This is the blue line. It's a little bit hard to see. It's not gone down massively, but it has gone down. And I can't see where the dotted line is. I apologize for the slide. Anyway, and then I had ChatGPT take this phrase, which I believe is true, and it wrote a little explanation of what's going on. Helmets made snowboarding more dangerous. This is a kind of a paradoxical statement. I don't think helmets do anything to make snowboarding more dangerous, but I think what it brings up is that boys in particular are looking for thrills. They're looking for differentiation, and they're looking to push the limits. And whether it's gaming or games and sports and so forth, whatever they want to do, they want to be at the edge. It's not really worth talking about to say, I sat on my couch today. That's not that thrilling. So people are always looking for more speed, and they're looking to do more. And a lot of times when you put the better helmet on, all that really says to the teenager is, I can jump higher. I can do more. I can absorb more. And I'm wondering whether you can speak to kind of the, I don't know, speak to that point at all.
Well, I don't know. I don't have any data necessarily on that. I mean, in a general sense, just anecdotally, when I was a young man, one of the risks I used to take was I decided to pocket the $2,000 I would have to pay for car insurance and sort of ride around. And when my bosses and other people say, "Well, why don't you pay for your car insurance?" I did this, and I also forced my work to give me the money they were paying for health insurance, which they got mad at because I was young and healthy and helping their pool in the work place. But I said, well, if you're for freedom and all this kind of thing, let me have the freedom to spend it the way I did. And they'd say, well, what if you get sick? And I said, well, what if I don't get sick? It's a
Yeah.
gamble, right? And with insurance, and I was half joking when I said this, I said, all these people that have insurance, they know they can get in a car crash and that it's not going to be that bad for them. I know it's going to be terrible for me because I'm not insured and I'm going to get in trouble with the law. So I don't get in car crashes for that reason. Now, that was a joke, but there is some truth in that, in the sense that you have a false sense of security when you put on a helmet or you have an insurance policy. And I think there's probably something to that. However, with football, it may have gotten to the point that the helmets got so extreme that people are running and um, doing things with their bodies that they may not have done in 1935 when they had padded helmets. And then around World War II, the amazing thing about the helmet, when I was in the Marines, we had a web suspension helmet. That technology was created by Riddell Helmets right prior to World War II. And the military said, hey, those would be good for our guys to have a web suspension helmet. And so I had a web suspension helmet in the Marines all the way through 2002. They stopped using web suspension helmets in the NFL, I don't know, late 1960s, early 1970s, something like that. And so they had better helmets in football than they had for the guys that were risking their lives for the country in the Marines and in the Army and all that kind of thing. So the football helmets, it may have led to all sorts of risky activity. However, I do think they're much better helmets. I'd way rather have the type of helmets that they have now than having a web suspension helmet. To me, that's a crazy thing that they would even play with those things way back when, but they did. And I would imagine they played differently wearing a web suspension helmet.
Right. All right. So I'm going to just point out your book for people. They can purchase it. You have many books, and I actually have read others of your books. I'm that guy who buys your books. You probably see me on Amazon.
Appreciate it.
And so this is The War on Football from 2013. So it's reaching its 10-year anniversary. And I really recommend it. I think it's topical. I think people still love football and they watch it. They go out for it. And what else do we have on you? Oh, I tried to find your review. There's a review of your book in the Wall Street Journal. For some reason I can't pull it up, but I'll leave it there. And this is talking, but this is an article I just had here. Declines in youth football predate Damar Hamlin's collapse. Will they continue? I don't know. I'm just going to. Well, one anecdote is my neighbor's grandson. He unfortunately is fatherless because his dad died from a brain tumor probably a decade ago, and he's reaching adolescence now, and he's a big kid. He's one of these big kids, and he's kind of a quiet kid and so forth. And there was a lot of friction and questioning whether he should play football because it's kind of a natural. I mean, I don't think he's doing that much stuff athletically, from what I understand. He comes by, periodically. I see him maybe a couple times a year, and right now he's just got so big. But he's trying out for football, and I kind of asked a little bit, and he's, I think they were antsy about it, but they acceded to it. I think it's we'll see. It's an experiment. We'll have to come back in a few years and find out what happened. But I guess the other thing I want to bring up is kind of a commercial for my own book. This is Overturning Zika. I recommend people buy this. It's got my picture on the front. And this is the pandemic that never was. There's not much coincidence with your book per se, except that in both cases, people assume that something is the case because
I
they've
think
read it.
there is I think there is something that coincides. I mean, there's a lot of scare stories in the media. When we were young, you probably remember they used to say, "Well, the killer bees are going to come up, and we're going to have killer bees in the United States." Every few summers, they'll have some big thing where a shark attacks someone somewhere. Hey, watch out for the water. There's sharks everywhere. As if this is a new phenomenon. The whole kidnapping thing, which is real, but it's not as widespread non-parentally as people think. So there's all sorts of stories that are amped up in the media. Zika being one of them, that I know vaguely a little bit about from years back, that never quite got up here, and I think had some effect in Brazil and some other places. And the football story for a few years, this was a scare story that was put out where the media has a feeding frenzy that's not data driven, but is sort of ratings driven. That this makes for a good controversy on television. And so there's all sorts of lies and distortions that get out. And I would imagine with the Zika book that you wrote that it was probably something similar going on.
Well, it's a fascinating story. I don't want to spend much of our time here. People should go look at it. But I will say this, that um, that it was a panic. That scientists, for their own aggrandizement, released some information which they thought was true, but they did it as a public health benefit. So there were three legs of the Zika stool. One is that Zika, which had never caused a single human illness ever in its 65 years of known existence prior to 2015, and had never been in Brazil, had never been seen, and there were no tests for it, no clinical tests. Anyway, somebody decided there was Zika, and it was caught at some of these mild dengue cases. And there's four dengues, and this little guy over here, this one here, Zika. It's not quite a dengue, but it's a kid sister of dengue that did, and he had to announce to the world in advance. And so that became a news blip, but minor because Zika doesn't cause any problems. He admitted it, but it was really paradoxical. He said he had to admit it because for public health, but they said, well, is there any treatment for this? He says, no, it doesn't really cause any problems. Anyway, that was part one. Part two was that in Recife, there were kids with small heads. Potentially, there were always about six in the city that size, 2.5 million. There were always about 5 or 6 in the wards. At this point, they had maybe 10 to 13. They thought, oh, this means something, and it doesn't necessarily. Has a little bit to do with the concussion studies and the data, and kind of looking for rare things happening. Anyway, so there's some aspects of that. But somebody from part one happened to live in part two. This guy Carlos Britos happened to live in Recife, they call Recife, and said, "Oh, that's new, and this is new. This causes that." And then he announced that to the press as well. It became a panic. And so they immediately assumed Zika caused microcephaly, and it's been going on ever since. When they looked at that very next year, when they started to get actual testing and actually standardize what is and what is not microcephaly, they didn't find They didn't find any burst in microcephaly. Actually, when they looked back, once they had no prior year data. So once they actually started to look back, they didn't find maybe there had even been an increase in that pandemic year. So it just kind of took life. It took wings. They have speaking billions of dollars, $1 billion got spent here and probably more around the globe to fund a Zika research establishment that keeps churning out more Zika articles.
Well,
but there has not been any Zika microcephaly anywhere on Earth ever since, including Brazil.
I think that the key linkage between my book and yours and other books of that sort is that one of the reasons why misinformation gets out there is that you have people in the press that understandably don't have a scientific background. I don't have a scientific background. I'm a layperson, but I can read some of these studies. And so they feel that they can't challenge what they're being told. I'll give you an example of this. There were a group of guys, including Bennett Amalu, that put out a product that claimed that they could find CTE in the living. And at the same time, Bennett Amalu in academic journals was saying you can only find CTE post-mortem in an autopsy and that kind of thing. But yet he had this product that they were claiming that they could, diagnose in the living. And this was a huge breakthrough. At the time, ESPN did an article about this, and Amalu was quoted and some of his friends were quoted. And I said, this is a little suspicious. And so I looked up the company and I found out it was established in West Virginia and not in Louisiana where they were based. And it was all messy. But a lot of the people who were talking to ESPN saying what a great product this was also owned the company. And
well,
that is an issue.
FTX. Speaking of football players, Tom Brady, FTX. People endorse things, and
But to have ESPN have people on as scientific authorities and not
yeah,
say, oh, by the way, the product that they're touting, they also own it. And so you see a lot of this kind of thing in within. There are a lot of industries that popped up where they had, drinks that address concussions, mouth guards that were concussion, helping mouth guards, all sorts of quackery stuff that people would sell out of like a buckboard wagon 150 years ago. And the press is ill-equipped to challenge any of this because many of the people pushing it are scientists. And once you put that white lab coat on, there's people that are afraid to sort of question anything you say. And even amongst scientists, even amongst people, doctors that have these white lab coats, they suffer from the same ethical lapses that everyone else does. Just because you have a doctor's coat doesn't mean you're ethically any better than anyone
no, we've
else.
seen that. We've seen that. I he may not believe this, but I have a friend, um, and he's a physician. And during COVID, he was treating children, and he early on, he healthy guy. He plays tennis and stuff like that, and no smoking and so forth. He and his wife, and both of them similar, had COVID. Original ancestral SARS-CoV-2 early on, and they had a cold. They were, kind of sick for a day or two, and I asked him about it, like, because he was the first person I knew to have it, and I was close to, I was physically close to him, and I said, oh, this is, how was it? How was it? He says, like a bad cold. Fine. I said, oh, well, are you still wearing a mask at work? He's like, yes. I'm like, but do you think you can catch it again? He said, no. I said, do you think you can give it to anybody else? He said, no. So I said, well, why are you wearing a mask still? And this gets to secondary motivations. He said, well, it's not the right time yet. I'm like, what do you mean? Wouldn't it be awesome that you could teach kids that there's a light at the end of this tunnel, that once you get it, maybe there's a sticker they could have, a kid sticker. It's like, I've been through this, I'm a hero, ask me why I'm not wearing a mask, that kind of thing. People have done this for all kinds of things. And he said, it's not the I said, well, what do you mean it's not the right time? I mean, the medic this is all evolving. He's kind of he's been on TV. He's a prominent guy, for other issues. And he said, well, we still have to get rid of Trump.
Well,
And
it's 2023. I was in a hospital yesterday. There's still a mask mandate in Massachusetts in hospitals and medical institutions, or at least a lot of the medical institutions. And so I asked the woman, I said, when's this going to end? She says, it's never going to end for some people. And for some people, there's certain percentage of the population that'll be wearing those masks, 2033. But anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I know as a physician, I've worked in some urgent care, and these days you still have to wear it. So everyone's healthy. It could be a 22-year-old with an elbow problem, and you're healthy as can be, no cold, whatever. And throughout the entire visit, you're wearing a mask. And I think this is inimical to the relationship part of medicine. But that's another day, another topic. I want to thank you for coming on. Do you have any draft predictions?
I haven't been following it that much. I don't have as much of a grasp on college football as I do on pro football.
Do you follow a specific team?
In college football, I go every year to the Harvard-Yale game. I mean, but those guys aren't getting drafted. At least they're getting drafted by like companies.
I go. I'm a Yaley, and I go when it's here.
Oh, okay.
In the Boston.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. Last year, it was at New Haven, right? No.
No, this year was at Harvard.
It was at Harvard. Yeah. I went. I went to the game, but I didn't go in. My mother was working outside the stadium, so I went in there, and we ended up not going in because my kids didn't want to go. But we were sort of outside with the festivities. Yeah, it was definitely at Harvard, and I haven't seen Harvard Square that jumping for years. So it was good to see finally.
It's a nice thing. It's a nice thing. It's a nice way to get together, and it was certainly put a punctuation point on our lockdown madness. Get people getting back together, enjoying themselves, and I think that's the real key to life. So that's my message to you out there. Life, you can sit at home, or you can enjoy stuff. There's danger wherever you go. There's risk. Be thoughtful. Be careful, or else you might wind up like us. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You can stay on. We'll chat for a second, but goodbye to everybody else. All right, bye-bye.